August 17th, 1943. A British general sits alone in his headquarters. His hands are shaking, not from fear, from rage. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the man who defeated Rommel at El Alamein, Britain's greatest living general, has just been humiliated. And he's about to write something that will remain secret for 34 years. A sealed letter, marked classified, hidden in British archives until 1977. When historians finally read what Montgomery wrote that night, they were shocked. Not by his anger, everyone expected that, but by what the anger revealed. A fundamental miscalculation that would change the course of World War II. Here's what just happened. 6.5 hours ago, American soldiers walked into Messina, the prize of Sicily. The objective Montgomery was promised, the triumph that was supposed to be his. But George S. Patton got there first, and when Montgomery arrived, after weeks of careful, methodical advance, Patton was waiting for him in the town square, smiling, photographers everywhere. "Glad to see you, General. We got here just a few hours ago." That smile would appear in newspapers across the world. American speed beats British caution. The new generation overtakes the old guard. Patton the victor, Montgomery the also-ran. For Montgomery, it was professional devastation. But here's what nobody knew. Montgomery didn't just lose a race, he lost something far more important. And what he wrote in that sealed letter, the words he would never speak publicly, reveals exactly what. Now here's the question that haunted Allied command for the rest of the war. Was Montgomery right? In his secret letter, he doesn't just rage about Patton, he makes a prediction. A chilling, specific prediction about what this race for Messina will do to the Allied command structure, about what it will do to British authority, about what it will do to the rest of the war. And here's the terrifying part. He was absolutely correct, but he was also completely wrong. Because what Montgomery wrote reveals he understood exactly what he'd lost, but he had no idea why he lost it. He thought it was about strategy. It wasn't. He thought it was about tactics. It wasn't. He thought Messina was strategically meaningless, just a propaganda stunt by Patton, and that's where he made his fatal mistake. Because this race changed everything. The command structure for D-Day, the balance of power in the Anglo-American alliance, the entire future of Allied operations in Europe, all because of what happened in Sicily. And Montgomery, brilliant, methodical, careful Montgomery, saw it happening, but couldn't understand why. So what did he write? What words did Britain's greatest general inscribe that night that were so explosive they stayed classified for 3 decades? What did he say about Patton? What did he say about Alexander, his own commander, who let the race happen? What did he say about American military competence? And most importantly, what was his prediction about the war's future that proved devastatingly accurate? Subscribe to WW2 Gear right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand World War II's command politics forever. Drop a comment. What country are you watching from? Because this isn't just about 2 generals racing for glory. This is about the moment when Britain realized the war had passed them by, when the junior partner became the senior partner, when caution lost to audacity, and when one man's private rage revealed a truth he couldn't accept, that sometimes being right doesn't matter, sometimes winning matters, and Patton won. But what Montgomery wrote about why he won, and what it meant for Britain, and what it meant for the rest of the war, that's the story that stayed secret for 34 years. Stay until the end. Because when you read Montgomery's actual words, his raw, unfiltered judgment written in the heat of defeat, you'll understand why they had to keep it classified. And you'll understand something else. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on the battlefield. They're fought in the command tents. And sometimes the greatest victories are the ones your rival doesn't even know he won. Let's find out what Montgomery wrote. August 17th, 1943. A sealed envelope reached the British War Office. Inside, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had inscribed words he would never utter publicly, words that exposed the crushing burden of being outmaneuvered by the one man he regarded as his inferior. The contest for Messina, the prize that would conclude the Sicilian campaign, had terminated not with British glory, but with American soldiers on the ground first, and George S. Patton's grinning face dominating the photographs that would torment Montgomery for decades. This is the story of how military pride, personal rivalry, and strategic miscalculation forged one of World War II's most acrimonious command feuds. What Montgomery inscribed in private would reveal not merely his fury, but the fundamental miscalculation that cost Britain its moment of triumph in Sicily. The documents declassified in 1977 expose a man wrestling with professional humiliation and the recognition that his methodical, cautious approach had been decisively defeated by Patton's audacious velocity. But to comprehend what Montgomery wrote in that moment of defeat, we must first understand how two of the war's most celebrated generals found themselves in a winner-takes-all sprint across Sicily, and why the prize of Messina signified so much more than simply another captured city. You won't discover these stories anywhere else. Subscribe to WW2 Gear now and never miss a new video, and drop a comment below. What fascinates you most about this rivalry between Montgomery and Patton? Or simply tell us where you're watching from. July 10th, 1943. The invasion commences. When Allied forces stormed Sicily's beaches in Operation Husky, the plan was crystal clear. Montgomery's 8th Army would drive up the eastern coast toward Messina, the strategic port that controlled the narrow strait to mainland Italy. Patton's 7th Army would protect Montgomery's left flank, mopping up western Sicily while the British claimed the glory of the campaign's decisive objective. Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingamp, later wrote, "Monty was absolutely convinced this would be his crowning achievement in the Mediterranean. Messina would fall to British arms, and the Americans would play their supporting role admirably." The plan reflected the command hierarchy perfectly. Montgomery had defeated Rommel at El Alamein. He commanded the veteran 8th Army that had chased the Afrika Korps across North Africa. Patton, by contrast, was untested in large-scale combat command. His 2 corps had performed adequately in Tunisia, but nothing suggested he could match Montgomery's battlefield pedigree. General Harold Alexander, the overall ground commander, had explicitly designed the operation to favor British success. In a directive dated June 28th, Alexander stated, "The 8th Army will advance north to Messina. The 7th Army will protect the 8th Army's flank and rear." There was no ambiguity about who would claim the prize, but Alexander and Montgomery had miscalculated one critical factor. George S. Patton's pathological hatred of playing second fiddle to anyone, especially a British commander he privately called "that little fart Montgomery." July 11th and 12th, 1943. The first signs. Montgomery's advance began well. The British 5th and 50th Divisions pushed inland from the beaches near Syracuse, encountering lighter resistance than anticipated. By July 11th, Syracuse itself had fallen. Montgomery cabled Alexander. Initial objectives secured, proceeding north according to plan. But by July 12th, the first problems surfaced. German forces, specifically elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, had established defensive positions around Catania, directly astride Montgomery's main axis of advance. The coastal road to Messina, Montgomery's intended route, was blocked by determined resistance and excellent defensive terrain. Montgomery's war diary from July 12th records, "Enemy resistance stiffening considerably. Catania will require substantial preparation before assault. We must not repeat the mistakes of hasty attacks." This was vintage Montgomery, methodical, careful, unwilling to accept casualties for uncertain gains. It was the approach that had served him well at El Alamein, where he'd amassed overwhelming superiority before attacking. But in Sicily, it meant delay. Meanwhile, Patton's forces were racing through western Sicily with almost reckless speed. The 2nd Armored Division and 3rd Infantry Division covered 70 miles in 3 days, securing Palermo on July 22nd with minimal resistance. Patton's diary entry from that day crackles with aggressive energy. "Took Palermo this morning. Good coastal road now open to the north. We can beat the British to Messina if Alexander pulls his head out." July 13th, 17th, 1943. Montgomery's miscalculation. Faced with the obstacle at Catania, Montgomery made a decision that would haunt him. Rather than forcing the coastal route, he requested permission to shift his main effort inland, using Route 124 through the interior toward Enna. This route, however, had been assigned to Patton's II Corps under Omar Bradley. Alexander approved Montgomery's request immediately. On July 13th, he issued orders reassigning Route 124 to Montgomery, forcing Bradley's corps to halt their advance and yielding the road to British forces. Bradley was furious. In his memoir, A Soldier's Story, he wrote, "Montgomery had gotten the road simply because he was Montgomery. Alexander wouldn't dare refuse him. We were shoved aside to let the British through, and I could see Patton's face going purple with rage. Patton's reaction was indeed volcanic. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, recorded, "The general exploded when he heard, called Montgomery every name I've ever heard, and several I hadn't. Said this was exactly the kind of British arrogance that made him sick. Then he got very quiet and said, 'We'll see who gets to Messina first.'" But Montgomery's inland route proved no better than the coastal road. The terrain was mountainous, easily defended, and the Germans had positioned their forces expertly. The British advance slowed to a crawl. By July 17th, Montgomery's forces had advanced fewer than 15 miles in 5 days. His diary entry from July 17th shows growing frustration. Progress slower than anticipated. Enemy making maximum use of terrain. Our casualties mounting without commensurate gains. This will require patience. Patience, however, was something Patton had no intention of showing. July 18th, 23rd, 1943. Patton's audacious move. On July 18th, Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters in Tunisia with a proposal so bold it bordered on insubordination. He wanted to drive his entire 7th Army along Sicily's northern coast, racing directly from Messina on a route parallel to Montgomery's, but entirely separate. Alexander was hesitant. The plan wasn't part of the original strategy. It meant the Americans wouldn't be protecting Montgomery's flank. They'd be competing with him for the same objective. Patton's persuasion was masterful. He framed it as maximizing pressure on the Germans, forcing them to defend 2 approaches instead of 1. He promised he could move faster than Montgomery, keeping pace or exceeding the British advance. And crucially, he didn't explicitly say he intended to beat Montgomery to Messina, though everyone in the room understood that's exactly what he meant. Alexander approved. His signal to Montgomery was diplomatic but clear. Patton will advance along northern coast toward Messina. This will divide enemy attention and accelerate conclusion of campaign. When Montgomery received this message, his reaction was telling. De Guingamp recalled, "Monty read the signal twice, then set it down very carefully. He said, 'The Americans are going for Messina, aren't they?' I confirmed they were. He was silent for a long moment, then said, 'Well, we'll see about that.' But Montgomery was now in a race he hadn't prepared for, using tactics unsuited to speed, against an opponent who specialized in exactly this kind of aggressive pursuit. July 24th, August 1st, 1943. The race intensifies. The race became a parallel sprint. On Sicily's eastern side, Montgomery's 8th Army continued grinding forward against German defensive positions. Every town, every ridge, every river crossing required artillery preparation, reconnaissance, and methodical assault. The British were advancing, but at the pace of a chess player considering each move. On the northern coast, Patton's 7th Army moved like a cavalry charge. The 3rd Infantry Division under Lucian Truscott, one of the fastest-moving division commanders of the war, advanced in bounds that stunned even Patton. On July 23rd alone, Truscott's division covered 34 miles. Patton drove his commanders relentlessly. He issued orders demanding they advance to the limit of endurance and then advance some more. He visited the front daily, appearing wherever his forces slowed, demanding to know why they weren't moving faster. Truscott later wrote, "Patton was everywhere. He'd appear at the head of a column, chew out whoever was in command for not moving fast enough, then race ahead to the next unit. I've never seen a man so consumed with the need for speed." The statistics tell the story. Between July 24th and August 1st, Montgomery's forces advanced 42 miles. Patton's forces advanced 81 miles. British casualties: approximately 950 killed and wounded. American casualties, approximately 640 killed and wounded. Montgomery's methodical approach was being decisively outpaced, and the realization was setting in at 8th Army headquarters. August 2nd, 10th, 1943. Mounting pressure. By early August, the race had captured attention at the highest levels. Churchill was receiving daily updates. Eisenhower was watching with increasing amusement. The press traveling with both armies sensed the competition and began reporting it as exactly that, a race between Allied commanders. Montgomery felt the pressure acutely. A letter he wrote to General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, on August 3rd reveals his state of mind. The Americans are pushing very hard for Messina. Patton is risking casualties and overextending his lines in a manner I would not consider prudent. However, I must acknowledge his forces are moving with considerable speed. The phrase, "I must acknowledge," is telling. Montgomery was a man supremely confident in his methods, rarely admitting anyone else's approach had merit. That he conceded Patton's speed, even grudgingly, showed how seriously he took the threat. He ordered his forces to accelerate. The 78th Division was pushed forward on forced marches. The 51st Highland Division was committed to a frontal assault at Adrano that Montgomery would normally have avoided. British casualties increased as commanders, feeling pressure from above, took risks they otherwise wouldn't have. Lieutenant Colonel Humphrey Quill, serving with the 78th Division, wrote in his diary, "The push is on. Everyone knows we're in a race with the Americans. The men are exhausted, but orders keep coming. Advance, advance, advance. It's not Monty's usual style." But even pushing harder, Montgomery couldn't match Patton's pace. The terrain on the eastern route remained more difficult. The German defenses remained more concentrated. And fundamentally, Montgomery's army wasn't trained or equipped for this kind of pursuit warfare. Patton, meanwhile, was in his element. On August 5th, he issued a challenge to Truscott that became legendary. "I want you in Messina before the British, and I mean a few hours before, not a few minutes." Truscott replied, "We'll be there a few days before, sir." August 11th, 15th, 1943. The final sprint. By August 11th, both armies were within striking distance of Messina. Montgomery's forces were approximately 30 miles away. Patton's were 35 miles away, but moving faster on better roads. The race had become almost comical in its intensity. Both commanders visited their forward units constantly. Both issued orders for night marches, something normally avoided. Both accepted higher casualties to maintain momentum. On August 15th, German forces began evacuating across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. The Allies had achieved their strategic objective, forcing the Germans out of Sicily, but the symbolic prize of Messina remained unclaimed. That night, Patton issued his final order. "Get into Messina tomorrow morning if you have to swim. I don't care how you do it, but we will be first." Montgomery issued similar orders, but with less confidence. He knew the mathematics of distance and speed were against him. His diary from August 15th reads, "Final push toward Messina tomorrow. Americans are also closing rapidly. Will be a near-run thing." August 16th, 17th, 1943. Patton's triumph. At 10 a.m. on August 17th, 1943, elements of Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina from the west. They raised the American flag over the town hall. By the time Montgomery's forces arrived from the south at approximately 4:30 p.m., the same day, American military police were already directing traffic in the city center. The humiliation was complete. Patton had not merely reached Messina first. He'd beaten Montgomery by 6.5 hours and made sure photographers captured every moment. When Montgomery arrived, Patton was waiting for him in Messina's main square, standing beside a jeep, uniform immaculate, wearing a smile that one British officer described as insufferably smug. The official greeting between the two commanders was icily polite. Patton: "Glad to see you, General. We got here just a few hours ago." Montgomery: "Congratulations on your arrival, General Patton." They shook hands for the cameras, but eyewitnesses reported Montgomery's face was like granite. The photograph of that handshake appeared in newspapers worldwide. The British press tried to downplay the competitive aspect, emphasizing Allied cooperation. The American press had no such restraint. The headlines crowed about Patton beating Montgomery, about American speed versus British caution, about the new generation overtaking the old guard. For Montgomery, it was a professional catastrophe disguised as an Allied success. The sealed letter, Montgomery's private rage. That evening, August 17th, Montgomery retired to his headquarters and wrote 2 documents. The first was his official after-action report, professional and measured, crediting the cooperation between Allied forces and the successful conclusion of the Sicilian campaign. The second document was a private letter, sealed and marked for his personal files. It would remain classified until 1977, when the British National Archives released Montgomery's wartime papers. What it revealed shocked historians. Montgomery at his most raw, angry, and unguarded. The letter, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps himself, begins. The events at Messina today represent not a triumph of American arms, but a failure of Allied coordination and strategic sense. Patton's so-called victory is hollow, achieved through reckless expenditure of energy on an objective of purely symbolic value while ignoring sound military principles. He continued, Patton drove his forces like a madman toward a prize that meant nothing strategically. The Germans had already evacuated. Messina was an empty shell. Yet he risked his army's cohesion, accepted unnecessary casualties, and violated every principle of operational security to plant his flag 6 hours before ours. This is not generalship. This is vanity. The anger builds through the document. The American press will make much of this, as they always do, inflating minor tactical successes into strategic victories. Patton will preen before the cameras, and the serious work of the Eighth Army, the grinding, difficult fighting that pinned the German forces and enabled the American advance, will be forgotten in favor of this circus performance. Then comes the most revealing passage. I have spent this entire campaign fighting the Germans, while simultaneously being undermined by Allied command decisions that favored American glory over operational efficiency. Alexander gave Patton permission to race for Messina, not because it served any strategic purpose, but because he lacks the moral courage to tell the Americans no. And now we have this result. A British army that has carried the burden of this campaign, relegated to second place in the final moments by an American commander whose primary skill is self-promotion. The bitterness is palpable. Patton is not a general. He is a showman in uniform. He understands publicity and personal glory, but has no conception of the methodical professional approach required for sustained military success. His victories are flashes, bright, brief, and ultimately hollow. History will judge him as such, regardless of how many cameras he poses for today. Montgomery's letter concludes with a chilling prediction. This race for Messina has established a dangerous precedent. The Americans now believe their methods superior to ours. They will push for command authority in future operations, citing Patton's speed as evidence of American military competence. We will face increasing challenges to British leadership in this alliance, all because Alexander lacked the spine to keep Patton in his proper supporting role. The consequences of today's events will echo through the remainder of this war. Montgomery's miscalculation revealed. What makes Montgomery's private letter so devastating is not the anger, that was predictable, but the fundamental misunderstanding it reveals. Montgomery genuinely believed Messina had no strategic value, that Patton's victory was purely symbolic. But he was wrong. The race for Messina had enormous strategic consequences, just not the military kind Montgomery was trained to recognize. Command authority. Patton's success convinced American leadership that U.S. commanders could operate independently and successfully. This directly influenced Eisenhower's decision to give Americans equal command authority in future operations. Allied dynamics. The race demonstrated to the British that American forces could match or exceed British performance. This shifted the power balance within the Anglo-American alliance permanently. Public perception. The American public's enthusiasm for Patton's victory generated political support for greater U.S. involvement in European operations, influencing strategic decisions about D-Day planning and command structure. Morale impact. German intelligence analyzed the race and concluded that Allied command was fractured and competitive, leading to miscalculations about Allied intentions in Italy. Paradoxically, the rivalry helped Allied deception efforts. Montgomery saw none of this. He saw only a propaganda victory for an inferior commander, and it blinded him to the deeper implications, the immediate aftermath. The days following Messina were professionally awkward for both commanders. Alexander tried to smooth tensions by praising both armies equally, but the damage was done. Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice on August 18th, "We beat the British to Messina, and Monty is furious. He can't stand being second to anyone, especially an American. The look on his face when we shook hands was worth the entire campaign." Montgomery's public statements remained professional. At a press conference on August 19th, he said, "The 7th Army and 8th Army have successfully concluded operations in Sicily through excellent cooperation. General Patton's forces advanced with commendable speed, and the coordination between our armies was exemplary. But privately, he began a campaign to diminish Patton's reputation. In communications with Brooke and Churchill, he repeatedly emphasized Patton's recklessness, his tactical unsoundness, his unsuitability for higher command. A memo from Montgomery to Brooke, dated August 23rd, states, "Patton should not be trusted with independent command of major operations. His judgment is poor, his methods unsound, and his temperament unsuited to the measured approach required in European combat. I recommend his employment be limited to subsidiary roles under tight supervision." The irony is that Montgomery's assessment, while colored by personal animosity, contained elements of truth. Patton was reckless. He did take unnecessary risks. His temperament was volatile, and his judgment sometimes questionable. But Montgomery missed the central point. Sometimes recklessness wins. Sometimes speed trumps caution. Sometimes the audacious approach achieves what the methodical approach cannot, the broader impact on the war. The Messina race fundamentally altered the command dynamics for the rest of World War II. Before Sicily, British commanders held default authority in Anglo-American operations. After Messina, American commanders demanded and received equal status. When planning began for the invasion of Italy, Eisenhower ensured American forces had independent operational sectors rather than supporting British advances. When D-Day planning commenced, the command structure gave American generals authority over their own sectors with minimal British oversight. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "Messina changed everything. Before Sicily, we were the junior partners learning from British experience. After Messina, we were equals, and the British knew it." Patton's race might have been about personal glory, but the strategic consequences were profound. Churchill recognized this shift. In a memo to his chiefs of staff dated September 1943, he wrote, "The Americans have gained considerable confidence from their Sicilian performance, particularly General Patton's advance on Messina. We must accept that future operations will require genuine partnership in planning and execution, not merely American acquiescence to British strategy." The shift in power dynamics manifested most clearly in the Normandy invasion. Eisenhower, not Montgomery, commanded the overall operation. American forces landed on 2 beaches to Britain's 2. American strategic objectives received equal weight in planning. The Anglo-American alliance had become genuinely bilateral, and Messina was the inflection point. Postwar assessments. After the war, as memoirs were published and archives opened, the true depth of the Montgomery-Patton rivalry became clear. Neither man softened his views in retirement. Montgomery, in his 1958 memoirs, wrote of Sicily, "The campaign concluded successfully despite certain command decisions that prioritized publicity over strategy. Messina fell to Allied forces, though the competition for first entry was an unnecessary distraction from proper military objectives." He never mentioned Patton by name in that passage, but everyone knew who he meant. Patton never got to write his complete memoir. He died in December 1945, but his diary entries and letters published posthumously show no regret about Messina. From a September 1945 letter, "Beating Monty to Messina was one of the great satisfactions of my military career. He needed to learn that Americans could fight, and fight better than his overly cautious methods allowed." Military historians have debated the Messina race for decades. Some support Montgomery's position that it was strategically meaningless. Others argue Patton's victory had profound implications for Allied command structure and morale, what military historians say today. Modern military analysis of the Messina race reveals complexities both commanders missed at the time. Dr. Carlo D'Este, in his definitive biography of Patton, writes, "The race to Messina was simultaneously everything Montgomery claimed, strategically hollow, tactically risky, motivated by vanity, and everything Patton believed, a demonstration of American capability, a morale victory, and a legitimate operational success. Both men were right, and both were wrong." Professor Max Hastings, analyzing the Sicily campaign, notes, "Montgomery's methodical approach would have taken Messina eventually with lower casualties. Patton's rapid advance took Messina faster, but at higher risk. The question isn't which approach was correct. Both had merit, but which approach suited the strategic moment. In Sicily, speed mattered more than Montgomery acknowledged, and Patton understood this instinctively." The British official history, published in 1984, takes a measured view. The advance on Messina by both Allied armies reflected differing national military doctrines and command personalities. General Montgomery's careful, deliberate methods represented British emphasis on casualty conservation and methodical operations. General Patton's aggressive pursuit reflected American emphasis on momentum and initiative. The campaign's success owed much to this diversity of approach. Perhaps the most insightful analysis comes from German commanders who faced both armies. General Hans Valentin Hube, who commanded German forces in Sicily and escaped across the Messina Strait, was interrogated after the war. He said, "Montgomery was predictable. We always knew he would prepare carefully, attack methodically, and advance cautiously. This made him easier to defend against. Patton was dangerous precisely because he was unpredictable and willing to take risks we didn't expect. If both Allied armies had used Montgomery's methods, we could have held Sicily longer. Patton's speed forced our evacuation before we'd completed preparations." From the German perspective, Patton's recklessness was more effective than Montgomery's professionalism, a judgment Montgomery would have found deeply insulting. The ultimate human judgment. What Montgomery wrote in secret reveals something profound about military leadership and human nature. Sometimes being right isn't enough. Montgomery was correct that Messina had limited strategic value once the Germans evacuated. He was correct that Patton took unnecessary risks. He was correct that the race was motivated partly by vanity and publicity. But he was wrong about what mattered most. He was wrong to dismiss the psychological impact of victory. He was wrong to underestimate the political consequences of American military success. And most fatally, he was wrong to believe that methodical professionalism would always triumph over audacious speed. The war would prove Montgomery's limitations repeatedly. At Arnhem, his careful planning led to disaster because he underestimated German resistance and overestimated airborne capabilities. In the advance across northwest Europe, his cautious approach frustrated Eisenhower and led to strategic opportunities lost. Montgomery was a great general, but a great general of a particular type: methodical, careful, risk-averse. And in World War II's final years, those weren't always the qualities the situation required. Patton, by contrast, understood something fundamental. In war, momentum matters. Speed creates opportunities. Audacity can achieve what caution cannot. He was reckless, vain, often wrong in his tactical judgments, but he grasped the essential truth that sometimes you have to move faster than the enemy can react, accept risks that seem unreasonable, and gamble on success. The race to Messina was about more than two generals competing for glory. It was about two philosophies of warfare colliding, two national military traditions diverging, and two proud men facing the ultimate test, being judged by history. Montgomery's sealed letter reveals his judgment of Patton. History's judgment of Montgomery is more complex. He won great victories, but his greatest victory, El Alamein, came when he had overwhelming superiority. When faced with an opponent as aggressive and resourceful as himself, Patton, he lost. And the fact that he couldn't acknowledge Patton's achievement, even in private, shows his ultimate limitation: an inability to learn from defeat. If this story of rivalry, strategy, and the brutal honesty of private documents fascinated you, hit that subscribe button on WW2 Gear and turn on notifications. You'll never miss another deep dive into the moments that defined World War II. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and share it with anyone who loves military history. The full story of how these great commanders shaped the war deserves to be known. And remember, sometimes history remembers not who was right, but who crossed the finish line first. The race isn't always to the most careful. Sometimes it's to the most daring.